So today I'm starting a new project, a transmission swap on the 1954 Country Squire wagon. So this is originally a V8 automatic car. It came with a 239 Yblock and a Ford-o-matic transmission. It currently has a 292 Yblock, also with a Fordomatic transmission in it. And it runs great. The transmission's working fine. The issue with it is a Fordomatic is technically a 3-speed transmission, but when you put it in drive, it starts in second and only uses second gear and high gear. Remember at the time when this car was new, it would have been competing with a Chevrolet that had a power glide, so 2-speed transmission. So low gear in this is only used when you shift manually down into low gear. So the problem with that is it's a little bit of a dog off the line, starting in second gear all the time, and it doesn't have an overdrive gear like we're used to on more modern cars. It's got about a 350 or so rear end in it and not very big tires. So it's not great on the highway and it's not very fast leaving a stop sign. So what I have is an AOD transmission. It actually was in my foxbody Mustang when I first did the V8 conversion on that car, but later I got a T5, so that car is now a V8 stick shift car, and I've had this perfectly good rebuilt AOD transmission sitting in my shed for about 15 years now. So I'm going to put that in this car, and the benefit of that is I actually gain 2 more usable gears because it will start in first gear and go all the way up into overdrive gear. The AOD is a great transmission. It came in all kinds of cars through the 80s and early 90s. The one I have is kind of the mid-year one, so it's a very strong transmission, but it's before they added all of the electronic controls on it. So it's a fully mechanical transmission. It needs some linkage to hook up to the carburetor for a throttle valve cable. But you know, there's no wires that are going to go to this transmission to make it work. I have bought an adapter kit. It's going to help me bolt this in. It doesn't help you make it work. So the adapter kit, which I'll show you in a second, it comes with a plate to mount the transmission to the Yblock engine. It comes with a starter and a ring gear and bolts and things like that. So it'll get it bolted to the back of the engine. The rest of that is my problem to get it to work. So I need a drive shaft. I need a transmission cross member because it's going to be a different spot. I got to run cooler lines. I got to hook up all the linkage and make the throttle valve work. So this is going to be a fairly large project, but it's winter time. It's snowing today. I'm not going to drive this car for probably another 3 or 4 months anyway. So great time to take it apart and make some improvements. And I think this is going to make the car much more enjoyable to drive. So this is the transmission that I'm going to use. It's a little bit dirty from sitting in the shed for all these years, but it should still work fine. Not a whole lot to hook up. This is where the throttle valve cable hooks up, and this is where the shifter hooks up. I'll have to figure out the odometer, torque converter sitting in the back of the car. These are the old throttle valve cables from when it was in the Mustang. I don't think I'll need those. But anyways, it's going to be a good transmission, and it'll be nice to actually get this in a car and use it. It's a shame it's been sitting for years. So here's the kit that I got to adapt the Yblock to the AOD. Comes with some instructions here, and all these parts. I'm opening this for the first time. And if you're wondering about the wrapping paper on the bench here, we had a Christmas party in here yesterday and we were eating breakfast. So this is the adapter that goes on the end of the crank. It comes with a starter, so I think this might be like a mini starter. So I may actually have to rewire how that all works, because it's going to be moving the solenoid down to the starter instead of on the firewall like a Ford normally is, but that's all right. I've got a package of bolts and fasteners and everything it looks like I need. New flex plate. This is apparently a neutral balance one that you need for this swap. And this kit was expensive, but you're not just paying for the parts, you're paying for the engineering. You know, any machine shop could theoretically make these parts, but the company selling them's already figured out what you need, all the dimensions, where holes have to go, things like that. So There's a big value in that. And there's the plate to make it all work and get along. So before I got started on anything major, I temporarily installed the plate onto the transmission to make sure it fits, because if it doesn't fit the transmission, it's obviously the wrong one, and I got to call the company. And it fits nice. Two of the bolts are too long because those holes are not threaded all the way through. I'm not sure what the story is here with this hole. The other holes are threaded all the way through. This hole is an offset hole, so I don't know if that's for like to bolt it up to a different engine. That's obviously an issue there. If that bolt comes all the way through, it's going to interfere with the starter. And then it does say in the instructions you got to trim the case a little bit. I didn't think it was going to be this much. That's huge. So yeah, this is what happens when you buy things that are supposed to work. It warns you in the instructions it might not bolt right up. There might be some modifications involved, and obviously they are here. So the one more thing I want to check before I start taking the car apart is that this torque converter and this flex plate are going to get along and made up, because torque converters don't all have the same bolt spacing. So if this lines up and fits, should be okay. And I'm doing it on its edge here because I don't want to lie it down on its face, because some fluid's going to come out of there. But these bolts all line up, looks like it's going to fit, doesn't interfere with anything, so I'm happy to start taking the car apart. So next step's going to be to jack the car up and start taking parts off. So we'll get her in the air and we'll go from there. So I got the car up at a comfortable height to work under. You'll see there's 6 stands under there, 4 under the frame and then 2 under the rear axle. That's only so that this is the equivalent of ride height right now, so that I can measure pinion angles, because I have to make a new transmission cross member. And I basically want the transmission to end up in the same place afterwards. And I got my level on here, we're 0.9 degrees. So I'll be able to do some simple math and calculate my pinion angles, knowing that this is where we are relative to the floor. And the reason I want that is if I have to use the garage for something else and I have to stop this project for a little bit and move the car outside, I can get it back to where it is. So I can remember, put stands in the same spot and set it up the same and be able to take measurements, because this might take several months and I don't know what else is going to happen in life that might interrupt me. So here's the transmission in the car right now. As you can see, it's leaking. So hopefully we'll solve that problem with the new transmission. This here is the cross member, but the mount's going to be further back, so we're going to have to figure that out. I'm a little bit worried about this cross member here. I hope I don't have to modify that because it's part of the frame. I'm going to do a little bit of measuring, but the first thing to do is to drain this transmission before we start taking stuff off. This is the fill tube here, so take that out and the fluid runs out. I'll grab a pan and we'll do that first, then start taking the drive shaft out and the other stuff. So this is 1 1/16. My wrench extender, because whoever put this in really put the beans to her. There we go. Threads on this. There we go. Let that drain. So this universal joint should come off easy because I just replaced it last year. It was loose. It's got these funny little locking clips that you got to bend out of the way to get a wrench on. So before I pull the drive shaft right out, I'm going to tape up this universal joint, because if these caps here come off, all the needle bearings will fall out, and then you either have to find them all and put it back together or replace that universal joint, which I don't want to. because it is a new universal joint. And they're not cheap anymore. This is like a $40 joint on this car apparently. And I don't know if I'm reusing this drive shaft or not, but I don't know, so I'm not going to waste it. And maybe someone's looking for this, right? That dude restoring an original 54 Ford car that wants it all perfect, they might be looking for this exact drive shaft, and maybe I can help a guy out like that. Okay, drive shaft's ready to come out. I am, wherever possible, going to put bolts back in holes that they came out of. Kind of just easier that way, so later on when I got a whole box full of bolts, I'm not going, well, which four hold the drive shaft in, or which ones are for the starter and things like that. It's just a good way to keep organized. It only takes you a couple of seconds. It's way faster to do this than put it in a bag and find a marker and write drive shaft bolts on a Ziploc bag or something. Go ahead. So the next thing I want to try and get out is the starter, which is that big guy up there. There's 3 bolts. 2 of them I can see. One of them I can't see. Maybe if I go up. No, can't get the camera up in there, which means I probably can't get my hand up in there. I can't see it from the top either. I have already unbolted the cable. Lost the washer there. The battery's disconnected. Not that it matters, because this is only live when you touch the key, but it's good practice to disconnect your battery when you're touching stuff like this. So get those bolts out next, and then the starter will be free. I think the starter might just sit up here until the transmission comes out, rather than try and get it through this space here, but we'll see. These 2 bolts I got out, which will allow me to take this access panel off in a minute. Oh, no, there's a 3rd bolt. I missed up there. That'll get me to the torque converter bolts. So on these Yblock engines, the torque converter bolts to the flex plate with these 3 bolts in 2 places. There's bolts all the way around, but it's only a few of them that hold the torque converter and the flex plate together. It's a really kind of unique design. I've never seen this before, because this is a little plate, this little sort of sawtooth looking thing. It bolts onto the torque converter, and then those 3 rivets there hold that plate onto the flex plate, which is this big, like 1/4 inch thick piece of steel. So I've never seen another car like this, sort of unique on these Yblocks. It's a totally different design than anything you'd see on a later car. It's a really interesting thing about these early Ford-o-matics is that they are air cooled. There's no transmission cooler lines. They're full of fluid, but the fluid doesn't go anywhere into a cooler. This is actually a cooling scoop to have air go through around the torque converter and cool it off. And the torque converter is this big, cool, thinned aluminum looking thing. Really interesting. The later Ford-o-matics were cooled with fluid, but these ones weren't. Okay, so here's the linkage, pretty straightforward. This one's the kick down or passing gear. So when you floor it, that pushes down and tells it to go in lower gear. And this is your control. So all the way up there is in park, reverse, neutral, drive, and low. And I think I sort of lucked out, because I think the transmission I'm putting in, the linkage moves in the same direction. So that'll be very helpful. There we go. So something I want to do before I take this transmission out, and we're close because it's just bell housing bolts and the cross member holding it in now. I want to measure the height from the floor of the output shaft on the transmission. And the idea is, when I get the new transmission in, if I set that the same, that will mean that the transmission is basically on the same plane or the same level or same down angle as it is now. So if the output shaft of the new transmission ends up exactly here, and this is exactly 2 feet high off the ground. That's going to be really close. Now the new transmission is like an inch longer. An inch isn't going to make that much of a difference, but if this is like way up here or it's way down here, it's going to change the angle in relationship to the rear end and potentially mess up my drive shaft and pinion angle. So if we can get this just shy of 24 inches, like 23 7/8, that should be very perfect. Okay, so Jack's holding the transmission up. Looks like all the bolts are out that hold the cross member in. I think the only thing that's holding it now is just kind of the tension of it, so it should just pop out now. There we go. Member's out. Now I got bell housing bolts and transmission's ready to come out. You see a lot of complaints these days about cars that are really hard to work on and bolts you can't get to. In this car, if you pull the carpet back and you pull out these plastic plugs in here, that is how you access the top 2 bell housing bolts that you can't get to from underneath. Thank you to whoever designed it this way. Okay, transmission is free of the engine. I just gotta get it out of the car, and it's sitting up on top of that cross member. So the front's gotta come down. I'm gonna do that hopefully without the torque converters falling out. It's gotta come out the front. Normally you put them in front up first, then the back up in, but the opposite on this guy. That'll be okay. On back a little more transmission. There you go. Keep my head out from under there. It's got to come back a little bit more for it to come out. And more on the other side than on this side. And I don't know how much this transmission weighs, but it's more than I can lift, and it's like enough to break my hand probably, or my arm if it falls on me. So, since it's not supposed to go back in this car, if it did fall and break, I would rather it fall on the ground and break than fall and break my arm or something worse. So just go easy, let her down, nice and slow. Pause for a second and look and make sure nothing bad's happening. It looks like it's just coming out nicely on its own. It's, it might just uninstall itself. That would be a beautiful thing. But I think it's going to catch on the flex plate bolts on the back of the crank. Get that out yet. Yeah, we're hung up there. Dumping more fluid, making a good mess for me. Okay. So the only thing holding it is the jack and the tail stalks. Now it's up against the floor. Easy does it. So that's what I'm worried about, is that torque converter is about to fall out. That's what that noise was. Zip ties, I'm just going to go around the front of the torque converter with them. I think those will be long enough so you can get them into a good spot on the other side. And basically just tie it in so that the torque converter can't fall all the way out. This is going to make a mess. And the torque converter is aluminum and it actually could break. And I don't want to break the torque converter if I don't have to. Somebody could need this, or me, in the future. So you can see here, because of the angle that the transmission's on, the torque converter wants to fall out. The only thing holding it in is that little bit of flex plate at the top. Super weird, by the way, to me, that the starter drives off of the torque converter, not off the flex plate on the engine. Super weird, eh? Anyways, those zip ties will keep it, I think, from falling out. I have done it. So the problem I have right now is that the transmission's stuck half in and half out of the car, and it won't come out because of the way that it is. The tailstock's jammed up against that floor brace, so it can't slide forward. It's also sitting on this big frame cross member right up there. So, it might need a percussion adjustment or something. So the transmission's jammed in between the flex plate and the floor. I'm gonna pull those flex plate bolts out. The whole flex plate will come off and give me hopefully plenty of clearance to pop this transmission out. That's gonna come off anyways, so might as well do it right now. Oh no, now we're stuck under the steering. No, this is not good. Haha! That's it, we're out. Okay, so transmission is out of the car. That's the first major step in this project. Pretty happy that I got that done on the first day I've been working on this. Got a little bit of a lake of transmission fluid underneath the car that I could clean up. That's just part of the experience. Next we'll be fitting the adapter plate. There's a spot I got to grind on that other bell housing. And soon we're going to have that new transmission in this car. Pretty exciting. Okay, so I'm back under the Woody. And after thinking long and hard about this, I've made the executive decision that I'm going to make this cross member removable. So basically I'm going to cut out the center part of it, sort of flange it, and it'll bolt in afterwards. I shouldn't lose any strength or rigidity in the frame from doing that, and it's going to make life a lot easier because the way the old transmission came out, the front had to come down first. The new transmission with that adapter plate is going to be longer, so the tailstock's going to be like back here on top of this. It's going to be impossible to get it in and out, and I'm starting to look at the floor a little bit. I'm worried I'm going to have to either massage the floor with a hammer a little bit or potentially cut a piece out of the tunnel to make the new transmission fit. I'm not sure yet until I get it in. So if I have to put this transmission in and out 2 or 3 times, With this in the way, it's just going to be a disaster. So that's the next step. I'm going to cut this out. I'm going to make as smooth the cuts as possible so that it's easy to fit it back in afterwards. And we'll go from there. So here's the removable frame cross member that I made. So it just bolts in, welded some plates onto the piece that I cut out and drilled holes, so lines up perfectly and holds the frame back together. So now I can remove that, and it'll be super easy to get the transmission up in there. The tailstock's going to come back to like about here, so this is going to make life a whole lot easier. I'll have to paint this and put the park brake cable bracket back on it, but it's all fit up, ready to go. Now I've moved under the hood because the kit includes a mini starter, which means I no longer need this solenoid here. So if you're not familiar with how these old Ford starters work, the starter is just a motor, and it has one big power cable going down to it, and when that's energized, it turns the starter on and starts your engine, hopefully. This is the solenoid or relay that makes it work. So it gets power from the battery from this cable. This is the trigger wire that sends power out to this wire, which goes down to the starter. So on the mini starter, we don't need any of this because that's all built into the starter. So what I need to do is extend this purple wire so that it goes all the way down to the starter where it's going to plug in there. And I need to send power to this all of the time, not just when the keys turn to start. When I installed a high amp alternator, I added this big fuse thing here. So I'm basically going to use this big fuse as like a terminal block. So all of my wires are going to go on here, so that still protects me from the alternator. And then I can totally get rid of this relay. I won't need it at all. I do think I'm going to make a new battery cable because I'm not super happy with this one. It's all kind of twisty. It's going to be not exactly long enough. And these ends are not in great shape. The negative one's actually got a crack in it. So this is a good time to replace my battery cables. I think I actually have a little bit higher gauge wire that I can use than this. So that is the next step. Okay, so I got my wires all hooked up. I have to come back through here and put some loom on these and clean them up just because I don't like the look of them right now, but they're all hooked up the way they're supposed to. I didn't end up making a new battery cable because I don't have ends. I thought I did. I'll get some in the next few days and replace that cable, but for now it's going to work. I ended up reversing these two so the alternator's on the back. Doesn't really make a difference. Current can flow either way through a fuse. So now if I touch the key, it should crank that starter. It doesn't have a flex plate on it, so it's not going to start the engine or even turn it over, but we'll hear if it's wired right and if that starter works. Perfect. That's a win. Crank adapter, the adapter plate, and the flex plate are all installed somewhat temporarily because I have to take everything out and put Loctite on bolts and things, but I didn't want to do that because I'm basically just testing to see if things line up and work. I've got I call this the detonator. This is just a horn button on a piece of a broom handle, and two wires go to alligator clips, so they're hooked onto the starter so I can fire the starter. I don't have the key on, so the car will not start, but it should turn over, and we'll see if this starter works and turns the engine over. I'm happy with how everything is lining up, so now I am pulling out all of these bolts that I'd already put in and Loctiting them and then torquing them down. So these crank bolts go to 75 to 85 foot-pounds is what it says in my Ford manual that my lovely wife bought me years ago when I first bought this car. It's a great idea to have the manual to go with any car that you've got. So I'm going to go around, Loctite these, torque them down, do the same with the flex plate, and then this is installed. So one of the issues on the Ford-o-matic is that they're noisy. They make sometimes a clicking noise or worse. This one was really noisy. And the issue is that this is the flex plate, and it's these brackets that bolt onto the torque converter and drive the engine. So there's those 6 bolts, 3 on either side, and this bracket is held on with rivets, and they get loose over time. This is the worst one. You can hear it there. And it makes that noise almost all the time. Mostly when you're not under load. Once you're under load, right, it holds it and puts pressure on that. But it'll do it when you're cruising, when you're decelerating, when you're idling at a stop sign. It's awful. And you wouldn't think that that would make a huge noise, but you'd be wrong. It is the noisiest thing. You would not believe how much racket comes out of there. And it's inside the bell housing, so I think it's actually like echoed around in there, and it just kind of drives you crazy. Okay, this is my first attempt at trying to put this transmission up into the car with just a floor jack. We'll find out a lot in a few minutes. Stay. The whole thing's got to go. Well, maybe not. Yeah, we're pretty well lined up. The tailstock's over this way a little bit. It's a problem. You can really see where this removable cross member helps, because I think my transmission mount is actually going to end up coming right off of here. I'm not going to end up with a separate mount, but maybe not. It's going to go forward a little more. Remember, as the jack goes up, it pulls back. And I don't have a torque converter in yet, because this isn't going to be the last time we go in and out. I'm really curious as to how bad it's going to be to get the bell housing bolts in, especially the top two, because the original ones had to come out from inside the car through those access holes in the floor. I'm happy to see the starter is not going to hit the exhaust, I think, because that would be a pain. So far, so good. Gotta go up a lot more. Now we're touching things, but okay, that was good. It was touching the floor, but then when I pushed it forward, it wasn't touching the floor. Can't be that easy. Oh my goodness. Maybe it is that easy. I have a bell housing bolt started. Oh my goodness. No way. No, it can't be that easy, can it? You're gonna trick me somewhere, car. This side has more stuff in the way. It's hard to see what's going on. Oh, no way. Did I just get another bell housing bolt started? No, I got 3 bell housing bolts started. Come on. I expected this to be like a disaster. I'm actually concerned that it went in too easy. It's like, what's gonna be a problem now? I'm not seeing a problem. Okay, I got 2 bell housing bolts started on each side by hand into the aluminum plate. Ha! Oh, that's good news. That is good news. That'll be harder next time because there'll be a torque converter on it. But beautiful. And it's not hitting the tunnel. Not hitting the tunnel anywhere that I can find. Transmission's in there. Not touching the floor. Anywhere. Lots of clearance. I can put in this cross member I made, actually. That is a win. Look at that. Transmission is in the car. Like I say, it's not hitting anything. It's not hitting the floor. There's plenty of space for everything. The mount's going to be here, so I'll be able to make a real easy cross member there. That's not going to be a problem. This really helped. There's also lots of space for the cooler lines, which was something I was worried about. The transmission cooler lines hook up here. I have had cars before where it's been a real problem getting the transmission cooler lines hooked up because the floor is right there. But look at all the space up in there. This is amazing. Today's job is to fix the sloppy shifter in the Country Squire. That's supposed to be park, so it should hold it up there. It shouldn't be able to fall down into gear and drive away on you. This plate here is basically the detent plate built into the steering column. So it's not like later cars where you can buy this and unbolt it and replace it when it wears out. And this one's 71 years old, so it's got some miles on it, and it should hold it up there. This piece right here is what's worn out, and I'll show you the back of it in a second. Completely worn away behind here and lets this pawl just kind of fall down in there. So if we look at the back of it, look how thin it is there, right? That's what's supposed to hold it. It's worn right away. I'm having trouble getting the camera to focus because it's so close, but you can see that's all worn out. So I have to make a repair on this. So I did is I started by cutting a piece out of a cardboard box in the recycling bin and then tracing on the back those shapes. That top one needs a little bit more work, but I got the general idea of it. So now I'm going to cut it out of a piece of metal. The metal's going to slide in behind there and create a detent plate. And it's not going to last 70 years, but I imagine when this car was new, it was a daily driver, and I don't daily drive it for about 6 months of the year. It sits in the garage, so this should last a good long time. So the plate's just kind of mocked up, held in with vice grips, and I get a little more fine tuning to do to make it as smooth as I want it. But this up here is park in that hole, and it cannot come out of park now. And by the way, there's a piece that goes on top of this that locates this rod a little better, so it's not quite as jiggly once it's together. So yeah, see, it's a little too tight there. There we go. So you got to pull it now to get down, and that's reverse. So you can't push it all the way up back into park. My camera to focus. And then that's drive, or no, that's neutral. So you can't go back up into reverse or park now, no matter how hard I push. That is drive, and then that one shifts to low. So when you're in drive, you can go into neutral and drive. You can't force it down into low accidentally. So if you're driving along, you know, looking cool with your hand on the shifter, it's not gonna push it down into low gear. And you can't push it up and go into reverse or park. So like say a little bit more fine tuning, and then I'm going to put a screw there, and then this hole up here I'm going to use a screw that holds a little plate that says park, reverse, neutral, and so on. That'll hold the top, and then this won't move around, and I think it's going to work out great. So one of the things I had to figure out what to do with on this transmission swap is an oil cooler for the transmission, because the Ford-o-matic was air cooled. There were no fluid lines going up to the radiator or anything. There is a cooler in the radiator, and I just changed the radiator to a new one, which is an aluminum replacement for a 54 Ford. So I'm not exactly sure how this is going to cool. It tended to run hot before, like over 200 degrees, which I don't really want in my transmission. And there's a lot of conflicting information out there about transmissions and how hot or cool they should run. Some people say there's a minimum temperature you need to get them up to. I personally don't believe that, because I see people with power glide transmissions go out and make quarter-mile passes, and they're not warming up their transmission fluid, and they're not having failures related to fluid in that case. So I'm not worried about it getting too cold. I'm worried about it getting too hot. So the decision I made, which might be right and might be wrong, and at the end of the day probably doesn't matter, is that I'm not going to use the cooler that's in the radiator. I'm going to use this, which is a fairly large external cooler. It's this size because this is the size that was on sale on Amazon. So it's ready to go into the car, mounted in front of the radiator, and it's going to be about probably 3/4 in front of the fan. This has an electric fan. It's a 16-inch. Right now I just have this line looped because I haven't finished making the hard lines that are going to go under the car and connect to the transmission. So once those are finished, I'll just trim this to length. But it's going to be really hard to get these little clamps on once it's mounted in front of the radiator, and I'll show you where that's going to go. The cooler is going to mount in front of the radiator. There's actually lots of space in here. However, once you start trying to get your hand in there behind the grill, it's pretty hard to work in there. And then the lines are going to come out this side. And if I can get down here, where that little hole you can see there is, I don't know what's supposed to be mounted there, but I'm going to enlarge that hole and make another one just above it, and that's where the lines are going to go through into the engine compartment and back to the transmission. You can see that oil cooler down there for the new AOD transmission that I'm installing. Okay, so underneath the car, I've got an oil pressure gauge hooked up to the test port. I think everything is hooked up the way it's supposed to be, and that gauge line is routed up to the top so I can see it without crawling underneath the car. And we're gonna fire it up and see what our pressure readings are. Okay, we're kind of at the test moment on this car. I'm gonna fire it up with the new transmission for the first time and see what happens when I put it in gear. An AOD transmission holds about 12 quarts of fluid. I don't know exactly how much was in this, because you know, you can really never drain them entirely, so the torque converter probably had quite a bit of fluid in. I put 8 quarts in right now, which is probably enough so it won't burn up right away, but that'll be something to check almost immediately, because it'll suck some fluid in. It's got to fill up the cooler, so I have a big cooler on this, so I don't know exactly what the capacity is. So This is a little bit nerve-wracking because I don't know if this is going to work or not. I've got a new starter, I've got a new flex plate, I've got a new transmission, I've got a new drive shaft, I've got a new rear axle. I also don't have rear brakes yet, so I got to be careful with that. The car is obviously up in the air, so it's not like it's going to drive away, but I got to watch that I don't put my foot on the brake at any point. And I don't want to go like reverse drive and jam it from reverse into drive while the wheels are spinning. So I'm going to open the door and we're going to see what happens. So first good news is I don't have fluid pouring out anywhere underneath the car. It works. It shifts. The pressure seems to be all right. I'll fine tune that a little bit once I can get wheels on it and drive it around the block, but everything seems to work. It's pretty exciting. I gotta vent some fumes out of here, even with the door open. It's getting a little smoky in here, but this is a win. Okay, so what I'm doing now is setting the throttle valve pressure. And this is the trickiest part of this installing thing, because if you don't get this right, you can totally ruin your transmission. So this is the throttle valve here, and you do the main adjustment by moving this guy back and forth on the cable and setting that gauge. So you start with this with no slack in it, and at 0 on the gauge, which is hooked up to the test port on the transmission. And then we insert this little gauge here. I had to make one because my cable didn't come with one in the kit. This is in neutral, running, and up to temperature, so we're not cold. We got warm transmission fluid. So now you pull that cable out and insert this. I'll show you that in a second. And then we should be around 35 pounds on that gauge if we've got it set right. So there's the gauge installed. So that pulls that cable out a little bit, which adds line pressure. So we're a little bit high right there. I'd like to be just a little bit lower than that, I think. 30, 35 is what we're aiming for, but we're definitely in the ballpark. I would rather have a more accurate gauge. I'm gonna see if I have one, but this is probably good enough to drive around the block and see if the transmission shifts. And then when I'm happy with it on my gauge, I can fine tune it here. So I'm actually gonna lock this down and leave it until I can put the car on its feet and get it outside and drive it around a little bit and feel it shift. But that's how we set the pressure. So I pull this out and the gauge goes back to 0, or it's okay if it's just slightly off of 0. And when I give it throttle, that needle should almost immediately start moving. Yeah, zoom in here. So that means I'm getting line pressure right off the throttle, which is what I want. So I think the next thing to do is actually go for a test drive. Well, the Woody's back together, the transmission is working, it shifts through the gears, I've got the throttle valve cable set, and now I'm going to take it all apart because I have a problem with the flex plate. This is part of working on old cars. Sometimes things don't work, especially when you have brand new parts. A lot of times they're no good from brand new, and I think that's what the problem is. What's happening is the starter only engages in a couple of spots on the flex plate. And I went back and looked at a video I had of the first time I had this thing cranking, and I didn't have the transmission in yet. So you could see that flex plate going around, and it looks like it isn't round. You can visibly see it's almost like an egg shape. So when the engine shuts off with we'll call it the bigger part of the flex plate by the starter can't come back out and engage with it. If you turn the engine like 90 degrees with a socket on the crankshaft, then it'll start. So I'm pretty confident that's the problem. I've got another flex plate on the way, so I'm gonna pull this transmission out. It sucks. I don't really want to do that. It is snowing today, so I might as well be working on the car, but that's just part of the journey when you're working on old cars. A lot of times you put them all together and you have to take them all apart and try something again. So I'm gonna grab some wrenches and get underneath the car and pull this transmission back out. Unfortunately, it's full of fluid this time, but it is what it is. March 11th, and I'm about to go on my first test drive in the Woody with the AOD transmission and the new rear end that I put in. I think I've dotted all the I's across the T's. There's nothing I can think of that I could do to prepare or test this any further. I've had it running up in the air with the wheels going around. So I know the transmission works some. This transmission worked fine when I took it out of my Mustang 15 years ago or whatever that was. So, should work. Fingers crossed I'm going to get back on this test drive. It'll be a success if I make it home and don't have to call my wife to come and tow me home with her 4Runner. Ideally, this is going to shift. I'm going to feel all 4 gears. It's going to ride nice and smooth. There's going to be no vibrations. The brakes are going to work because I changed the brakes in rear end. But I'm open to a little bit of tweaking. I assume I'm going to have to adjust the proportioning valve. This car does have an adjustable proportioning valve on it for the rear brake, so I'll probably have to fiddle with that. I don't know if the shift points are going to be quite right. I don't mind adjusting that. So as long as I go around the block and get back into the garage, I'm going to call that a success. So let's do it. Second gear, and we got brakes. Second, third, taken out for this rattling, and I don't like the sound of it, but other than that, this is kind of perfect. It's kind of idling along. Second, third seems fine. That's third. There's overdrive at 80 kilometers an hour. And the engine just kind of along so nice and smooth. Okay, so from a stop, that would be first, second, third, overdrive. I love it. Well, that went perfectly. That could not have possibly gone any better at all. I've got all 4 gears. It runs smooth, there's no vibrations, it shifts nice, the brakes work. It's a wonderful car to drive. It's so much better than with the Ford-o-matic. I think I have to adjust the shift points just a little bit with a little bit more TV pressure. It's a little bit lazy, especially going into overdrive, although that's not necessarily the worst thing. I think I need a little bit more rear brake on the proportioning valve. So the next thing is to just drive this car a lot and make sure everything's fine. I'm going to put a few 100 kilometers on it, and then I'll go over and nut and bolt everything and make sure, you know, nothing's come loose, nothing's vibrated a little bit. But otherwise, I got nothing else to do on this car. It's ready to go. Hopefully I get to drive it a little bit more. This is March in Canada. I can't believe this weather we've got. It just lucked out. I was so lucky. It's March break. I took this week off to spend with my kids, but I also got a couple hours to wrench on the car and go on this test drive on a day when the roads are clear and it's fairly warm out. I think we're gonna get some cold weather yet. I wouldn't be surprised if I have my snowblower out after this, but I'm so glad that this has worked out. And I can't wait to drive this car this summer. It's going on some big road trips, and I'm gonna make some videos of that. So if you like seeing this and you want to see the next video, hit the like button to tell me you like this so I'll keep making videos like this, and hit that subscribe button. Make sure you see the next one, and I'll see you next time out here in the garage.